I started being home educated in 1994, and for the last 8 years I've unschooled my own children. Over the years I've had hundreds of conversations with skeptical parents and disapproving school teachers about home education, but because of everything I know and have experienced firsthand, I've never lacked confidence or felt unable to stand up for home education. But most parents I talk to never feel completely confident about home education. And they often struggle to get their friends and family to support them as a result. But I don't want it to take you 30 years to feel like you're doing it right. You can get there so much faster. So I've condensed everything I know from decades of home education and put it into this video. I'm going to explain every step from leaving school and getting started with home education, right through to how home edders can get into college and get a job more easily than school kids. You're going to learn how to get out of school and repair any harm done by school. You're going to learn the single biggest thing that stops children wanting or even being able to learn, and that also leaves them forgetting everything that they study. You're going to learn about the different approaches to home education and why the two biggest concerns about home education are complete myths. It's everything that you need to home educate successfully and confidently, no matter how experienced a home edder you are. To start though, we need to clarify one of the biggest things that even most experienced home educators mix up, so that you can understand and then powerfully implement everything I'm about to tell you. Have you ever wondered why some people talk about homeschooling while others talk about home education? It can be pretty confusing as they're often used interchangeably, and sometimes they are the same thing, but sometimes they're not. There are basically two differences. The first thing you'll notice is that in the UK and in most of the Commonwealth countries, most people talk about home education. But in the US and in Canada, most people talk about homeschooling. So the first difference is simply geographical. Whichever term they use though, what they're talking about is the overarching idea of learning and education happening outside of school. The home in home education or homeschooling refers to who gets to shape the education, not where or how it happens. But there's actually a much more significant difference between home education and homeschooling that really does affect what you do and how learning happens. And when you understand the distinction between them, it will help you work out exactly how to approach and how to organise learning outside of school. Because when you're outside of the school system, learning really can happen anywhere and everywhere. At home, at the beach, abroad, in museums, and it happens all the time and at any time. It doesn't just have to happen during school hours. Now, people who don't have much experience with home ed often think that home education is simply teaching lessons and classes at home. And people who are new to home education often take that approach, but when you do this, you really miss out on the best parts of home education. You see, home education is really a broad spectrum of approaches. At one end of the spectrum, you have a highly structured, formal approach to learning at home. It'll have predetermined subjects to learn, lessons, assignments, curricula, even school days and term times. You recreate everything about school at home. That's homeschooling. People who picture homeschooling often think that because it's just like school, you actually need to be a trained teacher. Well, I can tell you right now, you definitely don't need to be a teacher to home educate, although I have found that some of the best home educators are in fact ex-teachers, not because they've been taught how to teach, but because they've seen the reality of the school system firsthand from the inside. So much so, in fact, that they tend to not try to recreate school at home. Which brings us to the other end of the home ed spectrum. At the other end of the home ed spectrum, you have an unstructured approach to home education that aims not to replicate school in any way, shape or form and focuses on natural learning through lived experience. It's what's known as unschooling. Unschooling is probably the least well understood approach to home education, and we'll talk about unschooling more in a bit. In my experience though, most home educators sit somewhere in the middle of the spectrum with some structured studying, but also giving themselves a lot of freedom and flexibility with that. Personally, I unschool my kids, and a lot of the work that I do with parents is helping them be able to move further towards the unschooling end of the spectrum with confidence. And it'll become clear why that might be important both for you and your kids as we go through everything. Ultimately though, there isn't a right way to home educate, and you can change your approach whenever you want depending on your family's needs. But wherever you sit on the home ed spectrum, there are ways that you can promote better learning and things that will stop learning happening without you even realizing it, which we'll get to shortly. Now you understand the home ed spectrum, how do you actually get started? Well, getting started with home education is like setting off on a journey to somewhere new. Sometimes on this journey you'll have a clear path, and at other times you'll take some unexpected detours. You'll find interesting places along the way or have moments of uncertainty where you wonder if you're heading the right way. And then at some point you arrive. But with home education, there isn't exactly a final destination because learning never truly ends. but you come to a place where your child is thriving and curiosity is alive and learning is happening naturally and easily. And the first step on the home education journey is getting out of school. Parents who are considering home education often don't realize just how easy it is to actually get started. Some parents even think that it's illegal for kids not to go to school and don't even realize it's an option. And if that's you, it might surprise you that in the UK and in the US and in plenty of places around the world, home education's perfectly legal. There are some places where it's not allowed, or there are restrictions on how you home educate, so make sure you check locally, either with a governing body like your Department for Education, or better still with local home education groups who tend to be the experts and can give you guidance specific to your area. Wherever you are, the logistics of getting started, especially here in the UK, tend to be really simple. In the UK, everyone essentially starts out as a home educator because you actually have to opt into the school system. So if you haven't ever registered at school, you don't need to do anything to start home educating. You're already doing it. But if, like most people, you're already in the school system, it's actually really easy to get out. You simply write to your school asking them to take your child off the school register. That could be effective immediately or on a specific date in the future, like at the end of the school year. I'll put a link below to a template letter for you because the letter should be quite specifically worded. Here in the UK, that's all you have to do to deregister from school, but that's really just the first step on your journey. It's not the end of the process. Once you've got your kids out of school, the next thing you need to do is get school out of you. Because when you first start home educating, you and your children will likely have spent years in the school system. And all that time in school really conditions us to think that school is what learning and education looks like. School-like ways of doing things become so deeply ingrained in us that it's easy to think that that's what you should do at home. And that's why so many new home eders start out by homeschooling. But that's possibly the biggest mistake you could make. When you recreate school at home, you not only miss out on everything that home education has to offer at the other end of the spectrum, but because school is a major cause of stress and unhappiness for children, it takes time to unwind that and reset their nervous system so that they're actually ready and able to learn at home. So instead of jumping straight into any kind of structured learning, the first thing you should do when you start home educating is spend plenty of time doing what's known as deschooling. Deschooling is the process of getting school out of your system. It's the chance for kids to move away from always being told what to do and where to go and get used to learning freely at their own pace. So when you're deschooling, it's important to let your kids choose how to spend their time. You have to let them do what they want. And for a time, they might not want to do much of what looks to you like learning. And this can be really challenging for parents, as it might seem like your kids aren't doing anything productive and are just falling behind. But what they're doing is actually essential. Letting kids be in charge of their day allows them to adjust to learning without the structure and rigidity of school. It gives them space to start to explore what's naturally interesting to them and lets them reclaim autonomy and agency over their learning and their life. This might be counterintuitive, but when they realize that they're in charge of their learning, they'll actually want to learn more. But deschooling isn't just for kids. It might even be more important for parents, because if you're like most parents, you went to school too, and you've got to get school out of your system as well. Deschooling allows you to begin to identify where school-like ideas are influencing you about what learning and teaching have to look like. It gives you the time to discover what your children are interested in and how they naturally learn. And it's the opportunity to reconnect with your children after years of them being at school all day, every day. So taking the time to deschool yourself gives you permission to let go of the idea that learning has to follow a strict schedule or a curriculum, and can help alleviate that knee-jerk reaction to jump into replicating school at home too quickly or too intensely. And by taking a break from structured learning and formal studying, it gives you time to begin to discover where and how learning is happening in your everyday life. You'll see just how much learning happens through everyday activities like going to the shops or playing games or simply going for a walk together. This begins to free you from the shackles of school and opens up the full spectrum of home education to you, as you're no longer limited to thinking that learning only happens through studying. One of the other important things to do while you're deschooling is to learn about the different approaches to home education and about learning itself, so we'll talk about that in a moment. But the question that parents always ask me about deschooling is, How long should I let my kids do whatever they want? And it's a good question. How long does it take to get school out of your system? Well, it's going to depend on how long you're at school, what it was like for you, and how much it's affected your nervous system. There isn't a set time, but a good rule of thumb is 1 month of deschooling for every year of school. So if they were in school for 5 years, 5 months of deschooling. You'll know your kids are done deschooling when they seem more relaxed. They're more curious and naturally motivated to learn. For you, as a parent, it might take a bit longer. But when you stop feeling the need to sit them down and study, and you stop questioning if they're learning enough, and instead you find yourself recognizing that they're naturally learning through the day, whether that's through baking a cake or building a fort, or simply following a spontaneous question down a rabbit hole, then you'll know you're done. But ultimately, it's an ongoing, lifelong process of freeing yourself from the limits of school. Now, as I said, as part of the deschooling process, you should start to learn about how learning really works. And to understand learning, we have to talk about the brain. Because from the moment you're born, in fact, before you're born, your brain is learning. Everything we know, every piece of knowledge and every skill is stored in our brain. But to learn anything, whether it's a language or reading or how to play guitar, you need to create and then strengthen neural pathways in your brain. When we do something or experience something for the first time, our brain connects these neurons together. But at first, these neural connections are difficult to make and it takes a lot of energy and effort. It's kind of like you're an explorer trekking through a dense jungle. The first time you walk through it, there's no path. You have to hack away at the plants and the vines to carve a way through. It's effortful and difficult. But the more you walk the same path, the clearer and more established the path becomes and the easier it is to follow. Walk that same path often enough, and over time it becomes easy to walk down it. Eventually that path's so well trodden that it's effortless to go down it. When those neural paths become so easy to walk down, that's when our skills and knowledge are deeply ingrained, and we can do those things or recall that information without even thinking. So the first thing to understand about learning from a brain-based perspective is that the brain learns on a use it and improve it basis. The more we use it, the better we get at it. It's why repetition is so important for learning. And this is more or less the only part of learning that schools get right. But it's not the only thing that's important to learning. Because making new neural connections is difficult and takes up a lot of energy, your brain is constantly trying to work out what it should spend that energy on. It has to prioritize. And it's wired to prioritize what matters most to our survival. So it assumes that the things that are around you, especially the skills other people have and the activities they do, will be the most relevant and important to learn for our survival. So if you grow up in England, your brain will learn English. If you grow up in Spain, you'll learn to speak Spanish because it's relevant and useful. It's why kids copy what we do and want to play with our phones and our computers or pretend to drive our car. They see those things are relevant to life, so they want to learn them. But when we stop using certain knowledge or skills, if something stops being relevant, it's like abandoning that jungle trail. And just like an unused path will eventually become overgrown again, the neural pathways in our brains will weaken or disappear over time. You use it or lose it. This is how our brains are designed to learn, by strengthening the pathways that we use, prioritizing what's relevant and letting go of what we don't need. But there's another part to learning that, if it's ignored, makes learning feel like a chore instead of something natural. And it's something that all mammals instinctively rely on. You see, every mammal on the planet, humans included, share a built-in instinct that drives learning. You see it across every environment, deserts, oceans, forests. That instinct is play. Now, you might think of play as just being about having fun or playing games, and that's definitely a part of it, but the importance of play goes much further. Play is actually how we develop problem-solving skills, creativity, and even our physical abilities. It's how we figure out how things work and how to do stuff. It's how we test boundaries and learn to navigate relationships appropriately. In fact, play is the foundation of all learning, from our first steps as a toddler to solving complex scientific challenges. When you watch children at play, their brains are actively exploring, experimenting, and making connections. They're processing new information and testing ideas by connecting things to what they already know. But there's a catch. Our brains don't stay in learning mode when we're stressed. When something stresses or scares us, it flips our brain into survival mode, activating our fight or flight response. And this actually blocks off parts of the brain that we need to process new information, and it shuts down the brain's ability to learn. So when their brain doesn't feel safe, play and learning won't happen. You see, we don't need to teach kids how to learn. We don't have to inspire them to learn. They're born learners. You just need to create a safe environment and give them room to play, and they'll follow their natural curiosity and dive deep into what interests them. And that's when the real learning happens. Play doesn't stop at 5 years old or even 10 or 15. Play carries on throughout our life into adulthood. But how your children play depends on how old they are. Play looks different for toddlers than it does for a 10-year-old or a teenager or an adult. But that doesn't change that play is the most powerful and essential part of learning. So if play is such a powerful way to learn, why do we insist on teaching them, making them sit still and study what we want them to learn? Well, as much as schools would like you to think that teaching equals learning, there's actually a dark side of teaching that doesn't often get mentioned. We often assume that teaching automatically equals learning, and yes, repeating information does strengthen neural pathways. But there's a big difference between merely being taught something and truly learning it. True learning doesn't come from hearing the same thing over and over. It doesn't matter how many times I tell my 3-year-old daughter 2 + 2 = 4. She won't learn it that way. I can say it over and over again, 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 2 = 4. And she might be able to repeat the answer back to me at some point, but until she understands that 2 and 2 really does make 4, she hasn't actually learned anything. Learning happens when something suddenly clicks. That eureka moment when you discover an idea for yourself. It's in that moment that you learn. The knowledge becomes a part of you. You can see it and you can understand it clearly, and the neural pathways for it are deeply ingrained. Despite the neat order of textbooks and curricula, that kind of real learning isn't a straight and predictable process. It's messy, not linear. Your child gets really into something, maybe for a few weeks, and then that interest vanishes completely, only to reappear again months later. In fact, those cycles of intense interest and engagement, followed by periods of forgetting, actually deepen learning by forcing the brain to re-establish and strengthen its connections when you re-engage with the material. Now think about what happens when you're made to study something that you haven't chosen. It probably feels like you're being forced to do something against your will. It raises stress and triggers your fight or flight response. That stress actually shuts down the very parts of the brain needed for genuine learning. So instead of absorbing new ideas, when we make children study something they haven't chosen for themselves, they're just learning how to cope with the stress and the pressure of being told what to do. And as a result, hours and hours of studying are wasted if the information never connects with their real life. Think back to your own school days. You probably spent close to 20,000 hours in school. But how much of what you studied do you really remember? Chances are the bits that stuck were the ones that resonated with you, that were relevant to you in some way or just sparked your interest in a small and unexpected way. Most of what you were just taught faded away because repetition without genuine engagement isn't enough. But there's another crucial element of learning that often gets overlooked when we focus solely on studying. So let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever struggled to remember someone's name when you see them outside of their usual setting? Maybe you know your barista's name when you see them in the cafe, but you run into them somewhere else and you suddenly draw a blank. That's because learning is a multi-sensory experience. When you learn information, like a name, your brain bundles it together with the sights and sounds and even the smells present at the time. So at the cafe, your barista's name becomes linked with the familiar environment of the cafe. And when you're outside of that place, you don't have all of those other triggers, the sights, the sounds, the smells, to help you recall the bit of information that you're looking for. And that's what happens when you study in one place, whether that's in your classroom or in your kitchen. The information gets tied to that specific environment, so it's easier to recall it there, but it's harder elsewhere. If you learn the same thing in different settings, your brain forms new associations. The more varied the environments and experiences that accompany that information, the deeper and more flexible your memory becomes. This is why hands-on, diverse experiences often make learning stick far better than just repetitive studying in the same old setting day after day. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with studying. In fact, studying can be extraordinarily effective, especially when you combine it with real-world experience. You read a little, you try it out, you hit a roadblock, that sparks some new questions, you go back, you study some more, you dig a bit deeper, then you go out and you try again. That Back and forth between studying and real experience cements real learning and understanding. Repetition on its own might build some of the pathways, but until you truly engage with and apply something, you're just memorizing things and regurgitating information that ultimately will just fade over time because it doesn't have any real meaning or relevance for you and your life. And unfortunately, that's what happens at the homeschooling end of the spectrum. In homeschooling, it's all about what the parent thinks should be studied, not what the child is naturally curious about. Parents become the teachers there, deciding the curriculum, planning the lessons, and setting the timetables. So homeschooling can feel easier for you as a parent because you control the day-to-day activities and you won't have to worry about missing out on important topics. But while it might be less stressful for you, it forces children into studying things that don't seem relevant or interesting to them. The focus there is on what should be taught, which ultimately raises stress and hinders the kind of deep, meaningful learning that happens when learning is led through curiosity and genuine interest. In the middle of the home ed spectrum is child-led learning. Child-led learning lets your children's interests steer their education. But how that happens can vary a lot. Some families adopt a very structured form of child-led learning that sits more towards the homeschooling end of the spectrum. For example, a child might pick a topic at the start of each term, and then you build the curriculum and the lessons around that choice. There's still structure, lessons, goals, but the key difference is that the topic or theme comes from the child. And because they're learning things based around something that they're interested in and that they've chosen, the process is generally more engaging and less stressful. You could also have child-led learning that's less structured. I have friends, for example, that spend about an hour a day doing some structured practice with reading, writing, maths, or science. The rest of their time is unstructured. And the further up the spectrum you go, the less structured it is and the less neatly subjects fit into boxes. The ultimate form of child-led learning is unschooling, which sits at the other end of the home ed spectrum. Unschooling is about natural learning through lived experience. So much so, in fact, that some people don't even like to call it child-led. There's no set curriculum, there's no rigid schedule, just real life, curiosity and exploration. But that doesn't mean there can't be any structure at all. Unschooling doesn't forbid lessons, classes, or even using a curriculum. It just means that children choose what and how they study, when they do it, and when they've had enough. There are several classes that my son goes to every week because he wants to. He chooses to do that. But they might want to learn about something for 5 minutes, or they might want to immerse themselves in it for months. Learning happens through everyday experiences when you're unschooling. It happens through play and the freedom to follow their interests for as long as those interests last. For example, if your child, like my son, has a love of trains, you could naturally explore and learn about history and geography and how trains help towns and cities to grow. Or you could learn about engineering and science and how the steam engines drive the pistons. Or you could learn about business and the entrepreneurs who financed and built the railways. We look at books, we watch videos, we've gone to visit the National Railway Museum, and we've been playing with trains since he was a toddler. You simply follow their interests and join the dots in whatever way works best. Unschooling is built on trust. Trust that children want to learn, and that they'll learn what they need when it matters to them and to their life. And when you trust that, there's no such thing as being behind anymore. There are no artificial educational milestones that you have to meet, no race to keep up with other children. In fact, in the things that really interest them, your kids could be miles ahead. And in the things that they don't care about, well, they might not touch them at all, at least not yet. And that's okay. Not everyone has to be good at everything. It's often better and easier to lean into our natural strengths than to constantly battle our weaknesses. The challenge with unschooling isn't children learning. It's parents trusting that they will learn and being patient enough to wait for them to be interested. I didn't want to learn anything about the sciences until I was in my 30s. And now I study the brain and neurology because I choose to and I find it interesting. So we know that true learning happens when curiosity is given room to grow. But what if that's only half the story? There's actually another aspect of feeling safe enough to learn that underpins everything else. In fact, it's the foundation of all successful home education and of parenting itself, no matter where you choose to sit on the home ed spectrum. And it trumps everything else. It's called a secure parental attachment. A parental attachment is all about the emotional bond and connection that you have with your child, which plays a huge role in how secure and confident they feel as they grow up. When children have a secure parental attachment, we are the safety net that helps them explore the world. But one of the key times at which a parental attachment gets disrupted is when young children who actually aren't developmentally ready to be separated from their parents are sent to nursery or school. This separation often manifests itself in behavioural changes like frequent tantrums or upsets. Teachers try and reassure parents by saying, "Oh, don't worry, they'll adjust." But adjusting is really just small children giving up and becoming resigned to being separated from their parents against their wishes. In reality, those tantrums and upsets are an expression of their stress response, fight or flight. And adjusting to school is just getting used to the fact that they're now living with constant stress from separation. Because having a secure parental attachment makes children feel safe, it's the foundation for learning at home, whether you choose to homeschool or unschool. When kids experience being loved and cared for by their parent, they feel safe and their brain is able to learn. That's all kids really want. They want you to be their loving and caring parents. They don't want you to be their teacher. But when parents start stressing about whether their kids are learning enough, they often lean further into teaching. They push, they pressure, and in doing so, you create the very conditions that make learning harder. The more stressed you are, the more pressure you put on them. The more pressure they feel, the more resistant they become. And before you know it, you're stuck in a downward spiral where learning becomes a battle instead of a joy. That's one of the reasons I have a free patience program. If you can be calm and patient with your kids, even when you think they're not learning enough, not only does it help your relationship, but it lets you create an environment that pulls them towards learning. But having a strong parental attachment goes even further than simply improving your relationships and supporting learning. It actually eliminates perhaps the biggest concern people have about home education. You see, people often worry that home-educated kids won't develop proper social skills or have enough friends. They imagine home-educated kids being isolated and lonely and unable to interact with people properly, being deprived of normal social experiences. Yet the truth is that home-educated children are often far better socialised than their schooled counterparts. What many people don't realise is that the foundation for developing strong social skills isn't found in classrooms. Socialisation is rooted in having a secure parental attachment. When your child feels safe, loved and supported at home, they gain the confidence to explore the world and build genuine relationships. And because you have more time available to spend together, parents can create a safe, supportive base from which children can explore social interactions and develop relationships at their own pace and in their own way. Practically speaking, they interact with a diverse range of people in real-world settings, actually out in society, not just with same-age peers in a classroom environment, which is pretty artificial. Home-educated children engage with people of all ages through community activities, clubs, and everyday interactions, like going to shops. They learn how to talk to older kids and younger kids and adults alike. Socialization occurs naturally through interactions within the community in a way that the child's comfortable with and with the safety and security of the parental relationship close by. So it's precisely because they don't go to school that home-educated children develop stronger social skills. But you still might need to be proactive and seek out opportunities for your children to engage with others who share their interests. Join home education groups, participate in community events, and find ways for your kids to pursue their interests alongside others. But remember, the quality of social interactions matters more than the quantity. A few close friends and meaningful relationships are far more valuable than a large number of superficial connections. And just like adults, some kids will be more social or extroverted and some less so, and that's okay too. The second big concern that people have is that home-educated kids won't be able to go to college or get a job. And I get it. There's a fear that without a traditional classroom experience, your child might lack the qualifications or the normal academic background that employers and colleges expect. But in fact, many colleges and universities actually look favourably on home-educated kids. By the time they're 18, because of the freedom and autonomy that home ed affords you, many home-educated kids actually have far more experience than their schooled peers. They've done mentorships, they've had jobs, they've been entrepreneurs and created small businesses for themselves. They've also had the time to concentrate on the things that interest them without wasting time on things that aren't relevant to them, and they've been able to develop their knowledge and their skills. So in an age where every school student studies the same curriculum, has similar grades, and writes much the same thing on their personal statement, home-educated teens can really stand out. Of course, some career paths, like becoming a doctor or an engineer, might require a qualification. And they can still sit exams if that's important to them. They might even take exams or go to college early, but they'll do it because they're ready, rather than because they've reached an arbitrary chronological age. In virtually every field, there are hugely successful home-educated people. In many cases, their success was actually due to home education, allowing them to focus on their interests and their talents. For artists and authors like Taylor Swift, Agatha Christie, and C.S. Lewis, homeschooling offered the freedom to pursue their interests and creativity without the constraints of traditional schooling. This was particularly beneficial for Beatrix Potter, who not only became a renowned children's author, but also pursued her scientific interests, making discoveries in mycology, and then later became a successful farmer and sheep breeder. Homeschooling allowed athletes like Simone Biles and the Williams sisters to dedicate more time to their rigorous training schedules while still maintaining their education. It was that flexibility that enabled them to excel in their sport at a young age, which led to each of them becoming the greatest athletes in their respective field. For scientists and inventors like Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and Pierre Curie, homeschooling provided the opportunity to explore their intellectual curiosities without the limitations of standardized curricula. That allowed them to delve deeply into their areas of interest, ultimately leading to groundbreaking discoveries and inventions. And then there are philosophers and political figures like John Stuart Mill and Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln, who benefited from the self-directed nature of their education, which fostered independent thinking and a broad base of knowledge. This contributed to their development as influential thinkers and leaders. But does this mean that if you home educate your kids, you're going to be successful? No, there are home-educated people who went on to be famous and successful, and there are others who didn't. Just like there are some school kids who go on to be famous and successful, but most don't. My point is simply this: formal education isn't a prerequisite for success. In fact, it can often limit what's possible. I think this is why there are so many instances of people dropping out of school or college to pursue success. Now, I wouldn't consider dropouts like Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Richard Branson, or Walt Disney to have been home educated, but they left formal education in favour of being self-directed and pursuing their passions, just like home educated kids can. Ultimately though, every home ed journey is unique, and you've got to find what works best for your family. But understanding home education isn't going to help if your own nervous system gets flipped into fight or flight and you lose your patience with your kids. Because the moment that happens, all learning stops. If you want to know more about how I can help you increase your capacity through brain-based training, I'll put links in the description down below. And if you want to know more about unschooling, you should watch this video next.